Things about me I don't know about me. All right.
So he's extremely
careful with that.
Hi to everyone watching through Facebook. This is new to me, so if I get too quiet or if I go too quick at any point, by all means, please let me know. But Eric first asked me if I could teach a Bible study session probably 2 years ago, Eric, maybe even longer than that.
It's been a little while, yeah.
Been quite a while, and at the time I sort of had this topic on my mind even back then, but God was still dealing with some things in my own life and in my heart, and I sort of knew it wasn't the time yet, and so I told him, well, maybe someday, but right now I just can't do it. So this is sort of a topic that I've been living and thinking about for a long time. And there's a lot of material here, so I'm going to try not to get too carried away, but it should be good. So he asked me again a few months ago, and I said, yeah, I think I'd like to. I had some chance to sort of work through a lot of this and put some things behind me, and hopefully this will be good. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is doubt. This is a topic that is very close and personal to me. But I think I want to open up with a few questions here, and so just throwing it out there, can someone give me a definition of doubt?
Lack of belief.
Lack of belief, that's a good one.
Skepticism that something's true.
Skepticism is a good one. Skepticism that something's true. I don't see anybody else. The official
uncertainty.
Uncertainty is good. Man, you guys almost hit the nail on the head here. The definition that I pulled off, I think Merriam-Webster, is to consider unlikely, to lack confidence in, and to question the truth of. And so let's look at the other side of this coin. Can anyone give me a definition of faith? Come on, guys, this one should be easier.
I would say believing in something even though you don't see it at that moment.
Very good.
Evidence of things not seen.
Evidence
without proof.
Yeah.
Evidence of things not seen.
I was going to be smart and say that too.
And then Dad threw out a keyword there, without proof. So once again, you guys just about hit the nail on the head. The definition that I pulled offline was a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. And I don't even I've got 5 pages here. You guys already know all there is to know, maybe.
Yeah.
But related to those two definitions, do you think you can have one without the other?
It'd be hard to do because you can have faith in something, but when something pops up, there's doubt that rises up.
Yeah. Shannon says it'd be hard to do.
I think human nature, you typically have both.
Eric, you got something on there.
I would say, both. Because you can say you believe in certain things, but then certain things happen, and then it makes you question whether it's true or not. I would say, yeah. Then I would just add on to that then you have a choice to make.
Yeah.
Do you have faith or do you choose doubt, I guess? The dark side or
So inevitably life gives you both, right? Is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And that's good. This room's good. I would tend to agree with that you can't really have one without the other. Even if you look at these two definitions, a firm belief in something for which there is no proof, and then if you define doubt, to consider unlikely, lack confidence, question the truth of, I think it'd be very difficult, just looking at it objectively, to have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that in churches, we tend to suggest that if you have doubt, that it's a lack of faith.
Yeah.
This room's pretty good in that regard, but looking back to my youth and some of the environments that I grew up in, I don't think that they were as friendly to doubt, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this. And I think I'm preaching to the choir to an extent here, but hopefully it'll still be beneficial. I'd like to change the way that we all think about doubt. Certainly, I've had to change the way that I think about doubt in my own life. So, 2 other related sort of questions, just sort of brain teasers for you guys, and then we'll move into the content here. But should Christians doubt? It's kind of related to what we've already talked about, but still.
God doesn't want us to. We shouldn't, but we do. And I think
fair.
you would be hard-pressed to find a Christian who has never doubted.
At least
And that's true, isn't it?
At some point in their... Yeah, I'm not saying that they doubt all the time now, but I would say that you would be hard-pressed to find one who's never had doubt.
we're going to be looking, by the way, at some really prominent examples here of people that have doubted. So you're absolutely right about that.
It's kind of,
Doubting Thomas?
well, it's kind of funny because Eric.
Oh, it gets
asked
better
me
than that.
Yeah.
About Bible study next month or something, and that's the topic I was thinking on doubt. And I've been studying John the Baptist because he's in prison, and that's John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and Holy Spirit come down on him. And then he went to the prison and said, Jesus, are you him? All these things you've done, do we look for another? And he said, take another look.
That's perfect.
So-
You've already touched on one of the things I'm.
So, even John the Baptist had doubt.
Yeah.
So, wow, John the
So-
Baptist, you know.
It's a little preview of what's to come. There were others too.
He's a big
There were
fan.
others.
Oh, yeah. That was funny.
Yeah. Full immersion.
Yeah, full immersion.
Amen.
Amen. Praise God.
All right. So here's another related question: do atheists have faith?
Of course.
Yes.
Eric and I have
It's
talked
head
about
nods,
that
yes.
before. I mean, how do you not believe in something if there's nothing to not believe in?
What's the definition of an atheist?
One who believes that there is no God.
Any kind.
Oh, so
If
you're
we
saying
define
they-
it
they
strictly.
have faith in something else then.
No. Well, they would tell you no. At least in most cases,
Yeah.
when I would tell you, they would tell you no.
The Bible says what? There's given to man a little bit of measure of faith,
Yeah.
something like that. So there's a little bit of faith.
I think it takes
Yeah.
faith
Yeah.
to believe in
I
anything.
mean, yeah, it don't have to be God
Yeah.
per se, or for an atheist, but when you believe that the sun will come up in the morning, or
Yeah.
and then when it does come up, it builds your faith into something else.
Yeah.
This is just my opinion. I mean, this is more of a philosophical question, but I tend to think that they do. I mean, to say, I flat out don't believe that there's a God, that's a pretty strong statement. When it's something that you really can't, inherently can't disprove, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that it makes it takes a measure of faith to make it, more than a measure of faith, to make a statement that strongly. There are some, self-defining atheists that won't make the statement that strongly, but I think if you take
Yeah.
it strictly for its definition,
Yeah.
I do think it takes some faith. So that's more of just a brain teaser, but for those of you, most of you know me pretty well, but I definitely have sort of a questioning nature. So doubt comes naturally to me, more naturally than faith, to be honest. I'd probably align more with Thomas than just about anyone else in the Bible. And it's I've grown to accept that it's sort of just the way that God made me. It gives me strengths in some ways, and brings me some difficulty in others. But it's just sort of a part of who I am. The struggle that I've had is sort of how to relate that with my Christian walk, especially growing up in some circles where doubt isn't really an accepted thing. And it's kind of like, I kind of think of it like anger, in that anger isn't a good thing if allowed to go unkept. But if you can direct it productively, it can have good side effects. And I would sort of say the same thing about doubt. It's not inherently a good thing. You'd in many ways be better not to have it. But I do think that it's necessary, and I think that if you apply it properly, I think it's good in the long run. We're going to go through a few examples of that, and I think that's something I'm going to be able to touch on more as we jump through this. But I'm going to start off by covering a few famous doubters. These are non-biblical, just prominent Christian thinkers and authors and so forth. But the first one on the list here is C.S. Lewis. So how many people are familiar with C.S. Lewis? I guess pretty much everybody in the room, I hope. If not, you should by all means look into
those movies we went watching.
Mere Christianity, and if you aren't familiar with C.S. Lewis, I'd highly recommend it. But I have a quote from him here, and if you don't know his full story, I think this quote says most of what you'll need to know for this topic. He says, "Now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable." So this is kind of where I'd like to, and I don't want to hold him up on a pedestal or anything, but this is sort of where I would like to get all of us at, the point where we can accept that, there are times, when you have to question, when things won't make sense, but you got to trust that God through that. And sure, on the other side, there are going to be times when, it doesn't seem like there's anyone in control, or it doesn't seem like there's a God. But at the same point, you want to be able to look back to milestones where it was like, man, how did I get through this? There had to be something going on there. And I think that most of us have at least a few things that if we're honest with ourselves, we'll point to and say, yeah, something happened there. It's unlikely that was just dumb chance, or times when we've been given a message or what have you. We don't all always have the same material to build on. I think that some of this is only gotten through a lot of prayer and making hard decisions. But that's sort of what I want to, where I'm trying to get us all at. This next example I actually hadn't heard of before. Some of you guys might be familiar with him, but Francis Schaeffer. Anybody know that name?
Sounds familiar.
So in like the late 50s and early 60s, he was a big Christian apologetic, but he's famous for sort of creating a spiritual / political, revival in this country. Before that time period, there really religion and politics weren't tied that tightly. And he was sort of one of those people that, encouraged to say, hey, we as a country, we're doing some things that are just flat out wrong. The church needs to speak with their votes, which, bear in mind, I think that in the modern realm, it has its ups and downs. If every Christian was living and loving the way that a Christian should be, it would be purely a good thing. And, in practice, there are some ways where, I think that it has some downsides, but, to have him say, hey, you believe in this, you're living in this way, I think that that's huge. You should speak with your vote and so forth. And, like I said, this was a huge revival. I mean, this really changed the path and the shape of this country. So if you haven't, looked into him, give him a quick look just to see what this man did. But the quote I have from him is, in 1951 and 1952, I faced a spiritual crisis in my own life. I told my wife, for the sake of honesty, that I had to go all the way back to agnosticism and think my way through the whole matter. And then, like I said, this guy went on to produce a ton of writings, a ton of Christian works, and reshape the entire American political front. So, some of us, I'm certainly one of them, have had to go back to that point. You've struggled enough with doubt that you got to go full circle and walk your way back through. And this last one I know you all know of, Mother Teresa. Hopefully everyone's familiar with Mother Teresa, right? Listen to how powerful this statement is. She says, "There's so much contradiction in my soul, such deep longing for God, so deep that it's painful, a suffering continual and not wanted by God, repulsed, empty, no faith, no love, no zeal. Souls had no attraction, heaven means nothing to me. To me it looks like an empty place. The thought of it means nothing to me, and yet this torturing longing for God. Pray for me, please, that I keep smiling at him in spite of everything, for I am only his. So he has every right over me. I am perfectly happy to be nobody, even to God." And I think that that's put just so beautifully.
Yeah.
And if any of you have been in that point where you're struggling deeply with doubt, I think that you probably have at least a little taste of what she was going through. I could never have put it into words the way that she put it into words. It just has such a beautiful prose to it. It actually, to me, it reads like a psalm. You've got sort of this, hey God, I'm in this deep, this troubling place. But in the end, she finishes with, "But I trust you anyway." Like I said, it's just beautifully stated. And then at the same time, you see both doubt and faith within the same few sentences. So once again, I think that these are good examples. I don't want to put these people up on a pedestal. They're just people. But I think that these are good examples of both faith and doubt exercised in a productive and a healthy manner. But you might say, well, that's great. It's great that there's some famous people in the modern world that have doubted, but, what about the Bible? I got plenty of those too, so just, hold on to your seat. I'd like to give a handful of verses here. I think I have 5 examples, so can I get someone to turn to Luke 7:18 for me?
7:18.
Eric volunteered Josh, so we'll give that one to Josh. And then can I get someone else to turn to John 20:24?
I'll take that. Oh, go ahead, Doug. Go
We
ahead.
can go in order.
No, I know. Go ahead.
John what?
John 20:24. But you got that one, Dad?
Sure.
Okay.
Luke 7:18.
Play nice over there, boys.
Is it 7:18 or 17:18?
Luke 7:18. And then Matthew 17:14. Can I get someone for that one? Well,
Take it.
Eric's
Matthew
got that one.
17, what?
14. Matthew 17:14. And then Mark 9:14.
Now,
Eric volunteered Shannon for that one. And then I've got one more, last one, Mark 5:21.
I'll take that one.
Brandon's got that one.
Did you say 9:21, 5:21?
Mark 5:21. And the thing that I'm going to say here before we start jumping straight into the word is that you'll notice a pattern pretty quick. The people that we're covering here, these were some of the closest people to Jesus. So, if you sort of expect that, them of all people wouldn't doubt, right? But we're going to find out pretty quick that there's plenty of examples of doubt here. Who had Luke 7:18? Was that you, Josh?
Yeah,
All right, are you there?
yeah.
Read through 22 for me.
Alright. The disciples of John the Baptist told John about everything Jesus was doing. So John called for 2 of his disciples, and he sent them to the Lord to ask him, "Are you the Messiah we have been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?" John's 2 disciples found Jesus and said to him, "John the Baptist sent us to ask, are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?" At the very time Jesus cured many people in their diseases, illnesses, and evil spirits, and he restored sight to many who were blind. Then he told John's disciples, "Go back to John, tell him what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life. The good news is being preached to the poor."
So I said you were hitting at it ahead of time, right, Shannon? And I can't say too much more than what Shannon said earlier that, hey, John the Baptist, of all people, doubted that Jesus was the Messiah. The one thing that I will add to that is that what won him over and what Jesus told him was said, go back and report what you've seen. Many are cured from diseases, sickness, evil spirits are cast out, and he gave sight to many who were blind. So, one thing that I would take from this little passage for those who are struggling with doubt is look for the fruit. And it's not necessarily going to be some miraculous thing. Sometimes it might just be a word. Sometimes it might just be a feeling of peace when you don't expect it. But when you do doubt, look for the fruit. All right, John 20:24. Was that you?
That's me, yeah.
Okay, read through 27 for me.
Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Keep going.
Yes, you're good. You're good. So Thomas is the textbook example of doubt, right? You've heard him talked about a million times. He's probably the only example of doubt that you'll ever hear in a church, right? And the thing that I want to point out is, not only did Thomas doubt, but Jesus had said, just 3-4 days before, exactly this is going to happen. And even then, when the disciples said, "Hey, we saw Jesus raised from the grave," just like Jesus said he was going to be, Thomas still said, "I'm not going to believe it, until I put my fingers in his wound." And I'd sort of point out that, I think we see something similar if we're honest in our own lives, or at least I certainly have seen in my life. You hear lots of stories, about Jesus working in people's lives, about God working in people's lives. But until you have that personal encounter, until it happens to you, until you have that relationship, that face-to-face, it's not the same. And so you see this in Thomas, and I think that, maybe some people are a little more prone, not to need that in your face, that personal experience. But for a lot of us, I think if we're honest, we need that personal encounter. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Thomas was one of the closest people to Jesus, and he went on after this experience to be, one of the most zealous disciples, right? He went on to do more than, a lot of people in the Bible. So the thing that I'd say to take away from this passage is, Jesus can handle our doubts. We don't need we don't need to sugarcoat them for him. And, if you feel like you need to sugarcoat them for your church or anybody else, ignore that. Give it to God. He can handle it. In fact, he wants it. He knows how we are. He knows our nature. He walked with people, physically walked with people that went through the same stuff. So give it to God. Matthew 17, who had that one?
It's me.
All right. Go through.
14, right?
Yep, go through 21 for me, Eric.
21? Alright. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic, yes, and he suffers terribly, for often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. When Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have the faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.
So everybody knows about Thomas, right? Everybody thinks about Thomas being the doubting disciple. What a lot of people don't realize is, hey, every single one of the disciples, showed a lack of faith. And we're going to cover that a little more deeply, but just from the top level, these were the closest people to Jesus. They spent all their time with Jesus, and yet Jesus says to them, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." So, I realize that sounds like a strong statement. Even Jesus had a human side and maybe had his patience shorted at once, but we're going to see here as we look into the story a little bit deeper that it wasn't stated out of any meanness or any contempt for the disciples. It was stated as the truth, and you'll see that Jesus has great mercy to bless people even through their unbelief. So to look into the story a little bit deeper, we're going to read the version in Mark. It's the same story from a different vantage point. And just to say it generally, Mark is my favorite gospel. I don't know what it is. I mean, they all, for the most part, tell the same stories, but for whatever reason, I just resonate more with the way that it's covered in Mark. So someone had Mark 9. That was Shannon. Shannon, read from 14 to... Shannon, you got a long one here. You okay with that?
Yeah.
Read from 14 to 29 for me.
Okay. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him. And he asked the scribes, What question ye with them? And one of the multitudes answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which had a dumb spirit. And whosoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to the disciples, that they should cast him out, and they could not. He answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him to me. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he asked his father, How long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, Of a child. Oft times it cast him into fire and into waters to destroy him. If thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said, If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. When Jesus saw the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter into him no more. The spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he came into the house, his disciple asked him privately, Why could not we cast him out? He said unto him, This kind come forth not but by prayer and fasting.
So there's a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, the Matthew version of the story, it focused more on the disciples. But this shows us possibly an even better example of doubt and faith acting in unison in the boy's father. And I'm just going to repeat a small section there. After Jesus talked to the boy's father, the father said, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Jesus replied, "If you can, everything is possible for him who believes." So you can see doubt in the father there. He didn't say to Jesus, "Please do this." He said, "If you can do this." And then the man immediately exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And this verse was a verse that, I'm going to be getting into sort of my story here a little bit later. But I prayed this verse, dozens of times a day for longer than I even want to think about. And I think that it's sort of, I would encourage people to use this as sort of the doubter's prayer. This man, God went on to heal his son, just like he asked him to. So, once again, I would reiterate that, Jesus can handle our doubts. God can handle our doubts. You don't have to cherry coat it. Be honest about it. Pray like this man prayed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And you can see that Jesus still blessed him. The other thing that I would point out is if you look at the end of this, in this verse, the disciples said, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And Jesus replied, "This kind come out only by prayer." In the previous verse, if you read, they say, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "Because you have so little faith." And he goes on and on. So I would point out here that you've got what seems at least at first like a contradictory story, right? And on one hand, he's saying, "Well, why couldn't we drive it out?" Well, it's because you lack faith. And in the other verse, he says, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" It's because you aren't praying. And from my experience, the two are generally are interrelated, right? Obviously, if you don't have faith, you probably aren't going to be praying. That's not true generally. It actually was almost the opposite in my story. But if you look at the flip side of that too, if you cease to pray, your faith isn't going to weather well. That relationship isn't going to develop well. So, keep in mind both sides of that coin as well.
Can I point something out real quick?
Absolutely, please do.
I went back because I was curious. When they asked Jesus about that, in Mark, in chapter 6, he sent them out by two previously before this encounter, and they were already casting out demons and healing people. So it even would take it in a deeper, thing of, sometimes we think that we just got things figured out, that, it takes a relationship prayer and faith to keep doing it. We just can't assume. That's why I think they were kind of dumbfounded as to why they couldn't do it, because they went and had been doing it already in towns.
And there's an example of that. We don't know. We don't know what was different about this particular boy.
Yeah.
We don't know if it was just the father's lack of faith. Obviously the disciples played a role too, where Jesus wouldn't have corrected them. But to state it generally without knowing all the details, someone had put a limit on Christ's providence, right?
Yeah.
There was doubt that he could deliver in this circumstance. Eric, did you have anything else to add? Or?
No, I went back, look, I was just found it fascinating, as I started thinking, I was like, wait, I'm almost positive that they've been doing this already. So, doubt crept in on them at that moment as to why. Because you remember when they bragged to Jesus about what they did, he wasn't impressed. He's like, that's what you're supposed to do. It's like, it was a teaching moment, that type of thing.
That's right, a teachable moment. These were people that walked with Christ, like you said, so thank you for pointing that out. That's good. Mark 5, was that you? That was you. That was you. So read from 21 to 43.
Okay. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered. and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.' While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother the teacher anymore?' Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, 'Don't be afraid, just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha koum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
So, I debated a little bit on including this one because it doesn't fit quite as nicely into the narrative that I've been talking here. This is really more about faith than doubt. But like we've kind of already talked about, the two are interchanged. So we've talked a lot about doubt here and about how Jesus is blessing people in spite of their doubts. Here's an example of abundant blessing because of faith. And I would point out there is a little slither of doubt here. The people come back and they tell the father, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's already dead. And I think that, I think the story is best viewed by trying to put yourself in Jairus' shoes, right? Here he's seeking Jesus. His daughter's sick. He knows she doesn't have that much time. And he comes to Jesus and says, "Teacher, can you come to my house? My daughter's ill." And they're on the way. I envision, I don't know if it's stated specifically in the story, but I envision them as going to this guy's house. And along the way, this woman jumps out and grabs Jesus' cloak. There's this big hoopla, and they're trying to figure out, who touched me. And, finally this woman comes forward, and she said, "It was I that touched you." And he said, how did he state it? I don't want to put my own words into this.
"Daughter, your faith has healed you."
Yeah, daughter, your faith has healed you. And that's a beautiful, beautiful story, right? It's an amazing story. But at the same time, Jairus had to be sitting back there thinking, man, here I had my chance. And, it's great that this woman got healed, but now my daughter's dead, Yeah. And I just envisioned that, and maybe Jairus wasn't that way. Maybe he had deeper faith than I would have in this situation. But, it's hard enough to believe in healing, right? It's a little harder even, I think, for us as humans to believe in someone being raised from the dead, which is what we saw happen here, right? Yeah. And despite these doubts, despite these people coming and saying, don't bother the teacher anymore, your daughter's dead already, Jesus said, no, don't worry about it. I've got this. And he healed the man's daughter. So, once again, I would just say, don't put God into a box. Don't limit what he's capable of. Don't feel like someone else is going to get your blessing. There's more than enough to go around. So not quite as neatly in the narrative, but I think it was still worth including for the... this is sort of the happy ending to this story, right?
If you think about those two stories intertwined, because they both went after Jesus, too.
That's right.
Actually.
I think it's kind of significant that the sick woman thinks that the act of touching Jesus' clothes is what heals her, but when Jesus actually talks to her, he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you."
Yeah, that's good too.
I mean, that shows that it's faith that has the power, and that wasn't always true. In the Old Covenant that God made with Abraham, you would have to do these ritualistic actions to become clean, but it sort of demonstrates the importance of faith as the central aspect of the New Covenant.
And that's sort of on the same line. I can't remember exactly what verse it is, but there's a story about, I think he was a centurion or something, and his child was sick, and he comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Well, we'll go." And he says, "No, just give the order. You have the authority." And Jesus said, "I haven't seen faith like this and anywhere." So.
The woman, her faith touched Jesus, because it says without faith it's impossible to please God.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because that's what made so significant, Brandon, what you just touched on, when Jesus read the scroll, and he said, he closed it, and he said, "This has been fulfilled now."
Right.
Now. And they're like, and I think it's funny too because my pastor pointed this out. I never thought of it. He goes, they referred to him, "Isn't this a carpenter's son?" They didn't even give him the luxury of being a carpenter anymore. You know, when he did that. So
Right.
it's really cool. You pointed that out.
So that, you know, once again, I think that faith and doubt have this, you know, this unique and important relationship to each other. And so even though this is covered from a little different angle, I think that it's an important sort of addition to this narrative. We're a little over halfway through at this point. I'm going to kind of jump into to some of sort of my story and my background. I wanted to make sure I gave you guys the word foundation at the beginning here. But I'm going to sort of run through some of my own story. And so you guys have known me, everybody in this room has known me for a long, long time. I did doubt to an extent in high school, not so much before, but that was sort of the point where I sort of went headfirst into the real world, right? And you hear all these narratives and things that, you know, for most of my life I've kind of been sheltered from. And I think that the important takeaway, you know, isn't that happened. That's sort of an inevitability. But I didn't really face my doubts, you know, at that time. I sort of said, no, you know, these are things that, you know, I don't really have to deal with. I don't believe these things. You know, I'll be okay. I wasn't in an environment, not that I wasn't in, you know, good churches. I was in great churches. But I think that in general, you know, we don't make a friendly environment for dealing doubt. And we certainly don't encourage people, especially youth, to deal with their doubt. That's going to be one of the things that I keep coming back to in all this. But I had these doubts, didn't deal with them in high school, carried them into college, and I sort of had this mentality that, you know, I had my divine co-pilot and I was going to be fine. You know, we'd cruise through, we'd come in for a landing a few years later and it would all be good. And yeah, that sounds really silly, you know, in hindsight, yeah. Sounds silly in hindsight. Well, yeah, there's certainly a few more than one flaw in logic there, right? My dad pointed out, you know, co-pilot is not really the order that things are supposed to be. But if I'm totally and completely honest with myself, yeah, I think that this was, you know, more the way that I looked at it from a position of youth. So, you know, I thought, no, I'll be good. You know, I don't have to worry about this so much. So even in college, you know, I didn't really deal with my doubts. A big mistake that I feel that I personally made was I let myself drift from a Christian body, and you know, the excuse that I used was that I was too busy, and I certainly was, you know, too busy in college. I made myself too busy. But the thing is, if there's something that's important to you, you know, you'll make time for it. And you know, once again, I thought I'd be fine because I had my divine co-pilot. But you know, the fact of the matter is, and this is another topic I'm going to keep coming back to. If you try to go things on your own, if you try to do things by yourself, you know, you're going to get yourself in trouble. God gave us a body for a reason. And if you look even at the example of his disciples, you know, he didn't have a couple close disciples, he had a dozen disciples, right? And those grew into, you know, even more apostles, right? There was a Christian body there from the beginning. And I think that it's important that we, you know, stay tied into groups like that. I had to learn that lesson the hard way, but I sort of, you look back over your own life and you can kind of see some patterns. I don't think I've talked to many of you about this. I've talked to Eric about this, but you know, there's a couple instances where I've been somewhere just sort of out in public and people have asked me for money. And, you know, if it's someone that seems genuine, usually if I've got something to give, I'll give it to them. And I was in school and I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was sophomore year of college. This guy asked me for some money to catch a bus. And, you know, I said, sure, man, I'd, you know, love to help you out. And I gave him a few bucks. He didn't need much. I didn't have much to give him, but I was able to help this guy catch his bus. And he turns around and he asks me, he says, are you a Christian? And I said, you know, yeah, I am. And he said, you know, thank you, you know, God bless you, and all this and that. And, you know, I wished him well. But I sort of, you know, the sort of interesting thing is I had something similar happen to me a year or two out of college. I was at Kroger down the road, and this guy was stuck. And he asked me for some money. You know, his car was out of gas and he needed some gas to get downtown. And I pulled out my wallet, and I can't remember exactly how much I gave this guy, but it was quite a bit. I didn't have any small bills. And I said, look, man, I don't think that you'd be here asking me. You know, if you didn't actually need this, I said, I want you to take this. And he was sort of dumbfounded, baffled, and he said, thank you so much. And he asked me, and I was actually, I had wished him well, and I sort of walked away. And he stops me, and he says, wait a minute, man, are you a Christian? And I stopped for a minute, because this was sort of after I had already been dealing with some doubts and things. And, I'm sorry, he didn't ask me if I was a Christian. He said, do you believe in God? And there is an important distinction there, by the way. He says, do you believe in God? And I stopped for a minute, and I turned around, and I hesitated, and I'd never hesitated like that before. I'd never been asked this question since I really started, struggling. I turned around, I looked at this guy, and I said, I don't know, And he said, well, it sort of took him off guard, too. I think he was expecting a resounding yes or something. I said, I don't know, man, and he said, I'll pray for you, and I sort of said thanks and turned around and walked away. In hindsight, I'm grateful for that dude's prayers, but I sort of look at these two things now, and they were a few years apart, and I sort of look at them as place markers in my life. I wonder if God didn't send those people into my life for that purpose. But that's just sort of an aside. So to rewind back to college, had all these doubts I never properly dealt with. My senior year, I had some serious doubts. Sort of realized myself on this slippery slope. Started seeking God with some increasing fervor. Prayed a lot. Still felt like my prayers were going unanswered. But I made the mistake of continuing to try to do all this by myself. In fact, it took 2 or 3 more years before I ever sought any kind of help with this. By graduation, if I was honest with you, I would have identified as an agnostic. And I'll just have a note here to add to that, on the fence is a dangerous and lonely place to be, right? You see people that, do just fine with atheism, right? They're sort of assured in their own beliefs that, have a certain confidence that comes along with it. And then on the other hand, obviously as a Christian, there's certain things that we take hope in and we have hope in that help us get along as well. Even though I think that for where I was, agnosticism was the honest place to be. To go back to what Mr. Francis Schaeffer said at the beginning, sort of having to go back to agnosticism and rethink through the whole thing. I think there's an honesty in that, and sometimes that's what you got to do to get where you need to be. But that doesn't make it an easy spot to be in. So, post-college, I already told the story about the man I met at Kroger. Give you sort of a feel for how deep this kind of went. Once you find yourself in the state of not knowing, in this state of agnosticism and sort of walking the line between belief and unbelief, I found myself, and I didn't stay in this state long, but I found myself sort of in a state of nihilism. And I always think back to that scene from Big Lebowski where he's like, they're nihilists, they don't believe in anything. And there's some truth to it, you sort of these sort of fundamental tenets that you built your life on, you have to rethink all of them, and all of a sudden you realize that you don't believe in anything. And there was a mass shooting during this time period, and I don't remember who it was after Alonzo, but it was one of these guys. And I remember just thinking, and bear in mind that at this point you'd seen so many of these that I think that anybody would have been a little, you get to the point where you have thick skin, but usually you have some empathy for these people, these victims, and I, for the most part, didn't have any empathy. I had gotten to the point where I'm like, this is just how life is. Life is an ugly thing, and sometimes people suffer. I think that sort of without a moral foundation, it's easy to find yourself in that spot. If you don't sort of believe that life is this precious God-given thing, it's easy to lose the meaning it's easy to lose track of how special life is, right? I think that's sort of an especially sort of pertinent, comment given what's happened, in the last couple of weeks here with this school in Florida. And this is an aside, this isn't something I had in my notes, but I read an article, and I can't even remember where I read it now. You could probably find it on Google if you want to, but of these mass school shooters that we've had in the last 10 or so years, the only example of one that had a sort of a proper family life, that had a father figure in his life, was the kid that shot all those people at Virginia Tech. Every other one of these kids grew up without a father. And I'm not saying that everybody that grows up to a father is doomed to turn out like that. That's not true. Please don't take it in that direction. But I think that you see how without this sort of support and training, people can end up in a very broken manner. You can say, like, I think sick is the right word for it, and not sick isn't gross, but just sick isn't broken. These people had a part of their lives that was missing. And I think if you extend it a little bit farther, not only were these people lacking an earthly father for the most part, with the one exception, certainly they were lacking a heavenly father as well, right? There's another form of fatherlessness there that can, put people in a really dark spot. So, anyways, once again, on the fence is an ugly place to be, and you can quickly descend into an even uglier place if you're not careful. It's just sort of like if you think about in Star Wars where they go into the cave, and he comes out and he asks Yoda, he's like, "What was that?" It's just what you need to take with you. Well, here's just what you need to take with you, right? This is where you can go if you let yourself struggle with these things too long. The other thing that I really, sort of the wake-up call that I got, I struggled immensely with my temper when I was struggling with doubt. And it's something that I hadn't... what sort of really made me realize the cause of this is, when I was younger, I used to struggle with my temper a lot. My mom would back me up on that if she was here. Thankfully, she's not here to give a loud amen,
Oh, he was.
Yeah. There's probably comments, amens in the comments right now. But I noticed I started struggle with my temper again, and it does come from the average too. But,
Not from the Lebrowskis.
Well, I better hold my tongue right now. But I think it comes both ways. I noticed that I had started to struggle with my temper again, and this was something that when I was younger I had spent a lot of time and thought and prayer about, and it didn't really occur to me until much later, that it was something that sort of broke down. I'd fallen back in this mode of anger, but there was there was one morning where
Is it your battery going dead?
there was one morning where you're just having a particularly bad morning, and this guy cut me off on the road, and he pushed me all the way off the road. I mean, it could have killed me, but if I had some common sense at that point, I would have just waited there for a few minutes to catch my nerves and then been on my way. It didn't do any damage. It could have, but it didn't. But in the hard-headed state that I was in, I got back on the road. I zoomed past this dude and blocked the road with my car, and I was going to tear this guy up when he got to the intersection. He gets to the intersection. It's this older gentleman, and he pulls up, and he's as kind as can be. He says, "I'm sorry. That was my bad. I shouldn't have done that." And I told this dude, I'm like, I lost my temper. I apologize to you. I shouldn't have done this. And so I got back in my car. I got out of this dude's way. But I pulled over, and man, that tore me up. I had one of those moments where I'm like, what have I become here? I sort of realized just how far off canter I'd gotten. And you look at that kind of thing, it's a bad thing to have to experience at the time. You want to talk about like rage, that was rage in its purest definition. But it was a wake-up call for me, and it was a wake-up call that at the time I needed. So all these things sort of coupled together, just getting a small taste for where things were going. I started seeking God with even more zeal. I never really stopped seeking God, right? I was struggling with these things, and I think that that's sort of something important to note. Obviously, if you accept your struggle, you're going to stay there, right? But this was enough of a wake-up call for me to sort of kick it into high gear. I've already mentioned that Mark 9:24 verse where the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Like I said, I prayed this verse, dozens of times a day. Started reading Psalms in the New Testament, and one psalm that I've sort of kept with me that really stuck out to me was Psalm 13, and it goes like so: "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I overcome him. My foes will rejoice when I fall, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he's been good to me. And I think that, once again, I think there's a lot of beauty in Psalms. And if you look through the verses, every psalm is like this, right? It starts with despair and it ends with praise. And so I think, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more, but, when we pursue God, I think that that's the way, one of the best ways that we can pursue him. Give your problems to him. Tell him how you really feel. He can handle it. But end it in praise. And it took a while for me to get to that step. It took a long time for me to get to the praise point. And I think that that's okay too. Sometimes it takes a while. Pursued God to the point of physical and mental exhaustion. Some days I would get out of work. I'd sit in my car. I'd pray or even just flat out sit there because I was too tired to go home. I didn't want to go home. I just wanted to sit there. I eventually did open up with some Christian mentors in my life. I think I opened up first with my mom, which is a hard thing to do because, you guys know my mom. And I thought for sure that, a state trooper could knock on her door and say, "I'm sorry, lady, your son died in some horrible accident." And that would be better news for her than me saying, "Mom, I'm not sure if I believe in God," Thank God that wasn't the case. She actually took it really well, and I think it speaks to my mother's faith that she did, take it so well. I'm sure there were some promises she was standing on during that time. But some other things happened. I got lucky that a former church member of mine was starting a young adults ministry in that time. And I really think in hindsight that it was a godsend. It was an easy way without really me even taking that first step to get plugged back into a Christian body. And that really helped me immensely. I actually met an older gentleman there, went to an encounter, and at this point God had already been dealing with me with some things. I had already made a ton of progress, but I went to this gentleman's encounter, and the guy asked me, "Do you want to be baptized?" And I hesitated for a minute. But then I told the guy, yeah, I think I would. And it wasn't that, I thought I've been baptized before. It wasn't that I thought I really needed to be baptized again, but it was kind of a promise for me, right? It was me saying, hey, I've struggled with these doubts. I've gotten past this point now, and I'm going to draw a line in the sand. Sort of a line in the sand for me, a promise to God. And it immediately, like that week, was probably the best I've been. It was hard that weekend. I had the flu. It was an outdoor encounter. It was in a tent in the woods. I had the flu. I had to sleep naked because I was just covered in sweat. It was rough, right? I paid a price. I paid a price for that. Maybe I went too far. Are we being recorded right now? Yeah, anyway, you heard it here. God will judge you if you start gossiping. Yes. That camping trip was rough. I paid a price to get to that point, but man, did God bless me in the following weeks. And just to sort of give some examples from my experience, how we can better handle doubt. And I promise that we're wrapping up here. Some things that I want to point out, ways that we can better handle doubt in our peers. Follow Christ's example. He always addressed doubts with patience, sometimes a little bit of frustration, but still with patience, love, and evidence of the fruits of faith. So for every doubter we discussed, Christ was merciful to provide abundantly, and he's still merciful to provide abundantly if we'll seek him. And even a desire for faith was rewarded, and I underline that because I think that's important. Even a desire for faith was rewarded. So if you're having one of those periods in your life where, it can be hard to have what you feel is true faith, take some comfort just in that desire for faith, because God will reward that too, like we saw with the man and his daughter. If we as a church do not engage doubt as Christ did, keep in mind that Christ always entertained doubters, right? He didn't push anyone away because of doubters. In fact, he let Thomas, touch his wounds. The world is more than happy to provide the answers if we won't, guys. And so if someone comes to you with doubts, please hear him out.
That's the first thing he acknowledged was Thomas.
That's right. That's right. He jumped straight to Thomas. And then the last thing that I'd point out is that, I think that we have a tendency to do some posturing in churches, to act like we're these perfect people that don't experience these kind of issues. Most people have doubted in one way or another, and I think the people, and especially younger people that look up to you as an example, they'll benefit from you being honest with them far more than they'll benefit from you pretending to be superhuman, right? To handle doubt in ourselves, just some things to take away. Be plugged into a Christian body. Don't try to go it alone. Seek godly counsel. Be open to your mentors. And then approach God with the right attitude. We saw this, all over Psalms. But, where you can say, here's my doubts, God, but I trust that you'll go here. I'll trust that you'll deal with them. We also want to seek God as a father, and I have a verse here to back that up. Romans 18:14-17, for those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, your Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share his suffering in order that we may also share his glory. I think that sometimes, and especially times when we tend to doubt, we seek God without this position of children, right? We seek him as though we were unworthy, and that's not the appropriate manner. I'm not saying that God won't bless that, but I'm saying that when you seek him as a child. Don't think that God's unwilling to forgive. Don't think that you're not worthy of his blessings or his attention. Seek him as though you are a child, because that's the promise that he makes. And then another note that I had was something that I benefited from is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of the third watch, and this is really just sort of an aside, but it's a period from I think 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And sort of going back to this encounter and sort of the ways that God blessed me following the encounter, I can be a little prideful at times, and that's not going to surprise some of you, but the whole thing of encounters, I'm really not a fan of encounters. It took a small miracle to get me to that one. And the excuse I always gave is that, you shouldn't have to go out in the woods to seek God. God's everywhere. And that's true. But, on the other hand, for ourselves, if we put ourselves in that position, it forces us to give God our full attention for a period of time. I benefited tremendously from that. I should know better by now, but, I'm sure that God will still have to smack me into place at some point. The same thing with the third watch. An older gentleman that was there with us, he mentioned it, and God forgive me, I thought at the time, I'm like, man, that's silly. God's the same any time of the night. There's nothing special about those hours. Day after the encounter, I woke up 4:30 in the morning, wide awake. I never wake up early, but I looked over at the clock and I'm like, all right, God, I'll do it. So I got up and I prayed for an hour, and man, it really blessed me. And I actually right at the end, literally within 2 minutes, got a text from another gentleman that went to this encounter, 5:30 in the morning, and it was exactly what I've been praying about. So, you want to talk about something that's too much for change? Yeah, he was. Yeah, actually, I think he did that every morning. God bless him. But still, the timing was just too perfect. Another takeaway that I give from my story: at some point, you got to draw a line in the sand. The whole point of faith is that you're never going to have complete proof, right? So if you're waiting for complete proof, you're probably not going to get there. But once you have something to grasp onto, once you have that relationship, draw a line in the sand, don't look back. And then actually I made my last point with that point. So that's what I've got. That was my story. I hope that, it's maybe resonated with some people, or at least something that you can use to hopefully bless some people in your life.